Well, if you joined me earlier during our service, then welcome back. If you're just tuning in now, welcome to this video where we are going to be looking at the story of Stephen from Acts. And I'm going to be touching on a few of the ideas that I had in the sermon earlier, and also just giving a broader look at where the story fits into the wider story of the early church, and some of the significance of that. I'm also going to be asking a question, and the question is, whose side are you on? I hope that this morning, as we go through this passage together, that we'll have time and space to reflect on our heart attitudes and some of the things we think about God and about others. And I'll try and lead us in some more kind of reflective spaces where we can pray. So this story that we read about Stephen fits into obviously a wider story of the early church. And at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came on them in a powerful way, and they were able to speak in different tongues. And then we've heard lots of different stories of the disciples coming to understand this Spirit, or rather yielding themselves to this Spirit and allowing the Holy Spirit, God's Holy Spirit, to move amongst them and to move in their words, in their actions, and in their deeds. And as this happens, the early church is forming. And at the point where we come to our story with Stephen today, they're still just in one place. They're still just in Jerusalem, and they're gathering there in people's houses. And it's very, very, whilst lots of people are becoming Christians every day, it's still very small. It's still very low key. And what we see through Stephen's death is that there's a huge amount of it amplifies the amount of persecution. It ramps it up enormously. It acts as a catalyst, and we'll see later how Saul, who becomes Paul, is involved in that. And what happens is that they go from being in one place and then they scatter. And this is a moment where it's a really important moment for the gospel, a really important moment for Christianity. And people talk about the Roman highways being what quite literally paved the way for the gospel message to be shared. Because after Stephen's death, and when the church started getting persecuted so heavily, everyone scatters far and wide, and they take that message with them. There's been a lot of speculation at the moment about a similarity being drawn between those Roman highways and the internet. I'm talking to you today on YouTube, and the internet enables us to share information in a way that has never happened before in history. And there's lots of speculation about whether what's happening now through the coronavirus and us having to be in lockdown in our homes, the church buildings are closed, but the church is still open, and we're still meeting together virtually. And we're actually able to reach a wide number of people. I'm told that some of you watching this today will be from Plymouth, some from London. And I've heard lots of stories of friends from St Mary's that have been joining us throughout this lockdown period. So our message is able to reach a wider support. And I've heard that from lots of different churches, not just St Mary's, from loads of different places. And so in some ways, this could be a moment in our church history that's similar to what was happening in Acts. I talked this morning about the verse where it says that they covered their ears and yelling, they rushed at him. And I talked about how we've seen people, out in the streets, seemingly covering their ears, not wanting to be part of a conversation, just wanting to get their opinion out there. And we thought about that. But then we also thought about how we can be guilty of covering our ears and not wanting to enter into a conversation ourselves. And so I just wanted to explore this idea a bit more. I don't know if you've ever read a story or watched a film where there's kind of two sides to it, and you naturally place yourself with one side or the other. So the example that comes to mind for me that I think of is the Hunger Games, where you've got this oppressive elite class that are ruling over all these districts, and the districts are rising up to fight that elite class. And naturally, you place yourself with Katniss, the main character, as she bravely steps into this mission to bring down the corrupt, unjust upper class. But as you read through the story, you think, am I really in District 12? Am I really? We always want to root for the underdog, don't we? But my question is, whose side are we on? Are we actually on the side of the underdog? Or are we often in that corrupt upper class, that oppressive upper class? I'm not just talking about the Black Lives Matter campaign here. I'm talking about all kinds of things. I'm talking about issues of climate crisis, any issue of injustice, or any issue where people are being oppressed. So that might help you. Maybe you haven't read The Hunger Games, and maybe that's not a helpful metaphor to think of, but maybe you can think of a story where there's a similar situation. Elysium, the movie, would be another one. The other thing that I think about with this is there's biblical stories that we need to question very carefully who we represent in that story, or who represents us, sorry, in that story. So the story of the prodigal son, one of the most famous stories that Jesus told. And for years, I loved that story because I just felt such a connection to that prodigal son coming home and finding God, finding the Father, waiting there with open arms. And one day someone said to me, are you sure that you're the younger son? Are you sure you're not the older son? And I was baffled to begin with. I thought, it's never even occurred to me to compare myself to the older brother. The one that has been, in his father's house the whole time and is just moaning and grumbling about the fact that he doesn't have everything that his younger brother's getting given. But that turned it around for me. And it's similar with other stories that we're told of Jesus in the Gospels. There's so many places where he's arguing with the Pharisees, and you can read through it and you think you're right there with Jesus. But actually, if you stop and think about it, are we not more like the Pharisees? We want to be on the good guy's side. And we can see who the good guy is in the gospel message. We can see that the Pharisees and the scribes and the religious leaders of the day are the people in the wrong. And we distance ourselves from them. But it makes me question whether we avoid having a hard conversation with ourselves, a hard conversation with each other about our attitudes and the way, and it prevents us from coming to Jesus, I think, and asking for forgiveness and changing our attitudes. We can stick our heads in the sand and say, of course we agree with everything Jesus is saying, when in reality we're on the side of the Pharisees. And so in this story where we've heard about the people from the Sanhedrin grabbing Stephen and actually illegally stoning him, it's more like a lynch mob than actual justice being issued here. We so easily place ourselves on Stephen's side. But are we really? Like I said earlier, when we're looking at people covering their ears and yelling, are we ignoring the fact that we might be covering our ears and yelling? I want to think for a moment about Saul. Saul is there throughout this story. We see him mentioned in various verses. And we know that Saul is going to go on to be renamed Paul, and he's going to become one of the heroes of our faith. He's going to write letters to all kinds of churches, which will end up making up a large part of our New Testament, and his teaching will be hugely influential. And we see him as someone that knows God intimately. And here he is, watching Stephen being stoned, watching him die, seeing that same thing that the rest of them are seeing, which was that they saw that he had a face like an angel, that angelic face, that presence of God coming out through his face. And we can't help to ask, how was Saul affected by everything he saw? Immediately after the passage, it actually strengthens his resolve in persecuting the early church, and he was a big part of that group I was mentioning earlier that persecuted the church and caused them to scatter. But actually, it just makes me wonder what was going on in his heart. Because my experience with God is that he knows that we can't do cope with everything at once. We're on this journey of redemption, and he knows that we can't go from one day being the person that we are to the next day being perfection and to having no incorrect thoughts, no incorrect attitudes. But he slowly works in us. And so the things that we see, the people that inspire us, the things that we see that look ugly to us, the things that we go, oh, I just heard what I said there. That wasn't right. All of this calls us to a need to be humble. When God took Saul from being Saul to being Paul, one of the things he did was that he took away his sight, he took away his vision. He forced him to become humble. He's forced him into a place of vulnerability. And so as we look at this passage from Acts, as we think about what Stephen went through, are we able to ourselves become vulnerable to what the Holy Spirit wants to do in us, what he gently, kindly wants to do in us? Are we willing to change? Are we willing to grow? Are we willing to force ourselves to be vulnerable? So let's take some time now for that. There's going to be some music playing quietly in the background. Some things are going to come up on the screen to help you think through this. I'd just like to guide us through a brief time of reflection on this passage. Lord, thank you that you love us and we can trust in your grace. We're sorry for when we've covered our ears. Help us to be teachable. Thank you that you're patient with us and want to work for our good. Well, thank you for joining me today. I hope that that's been helpful and that God's spoken to you. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.